Before the first Viking ship ever touched water, before the first golden wheat grew in the north, there was another Scandinavia. Not a land of kings or raiders, but of survivors, a people whose names were never written, whose faces were never painted, but whose DNA still lives in fragments inside us. The year is 11,700 years ago. The last ice age is ending. Across northern Europe, the glaciers, once towering as high as mountains, are breaking, cracking, and sliding back into the sea. What they leave behind is an empty world, deep valleys carved by ice, new rivers from the meltwater, and forests just beginning to take root in the thawing earth. And then, the first footsteps. But they don't come from one direction. They come from two completely opposite worlds. From the south, pushing up through what is now Denmark and northern Germany, come the Western hunter-gatherers, WHG. They bring a legacy from Ice Age Europe: dark hair, darker skin, stone tools shaped in the Arensbergian style, tools their ancestors carried for generations. From the northeast, hugging the ice-free Atlantic coast of Norway, come the Eastern Hunter-Gatherers, EHG. They carry ancient North Eurasian, ANE, ancestry, a genetic fingerprint from far beyond Europe's borders. In their hands, the pressure blade technique, a razor-sharp innovation in stoneworking, perfected for hunting in cold coastal lands. Archaeology tells us exactly where these worlds touched: Arensbergian sites in the south, pressure blade sites in the north. But here, in the middle of a still young Scandinavia, their bloodlines mix, creating a new people. We know them today as the Scandinavian Hunter-Gatherers, SHG. Their genetic recipe is precise: 2/3 WHG, 1/3 EHG. This mix brings them pale skin, light eyes, and the TMM1311 gene, a rare adaptation for surviving extreme cold. For thousands of years, life here has barely changed. Small fishing villages cling to the coast. Hunters stalk elk in the forests. Bone harpoons pass from father to son. Their children are born under the same stars as their ancestors, and they die in the same valleys. Until the strangers arrive. Not wanderers, not hunters, but people who bring an entirely different way of life, one that will change everything. And when they came, they didn't just change the land, they erased an entire genetic world in a single generation. But what kind of people could do that? And why had Scandinavia, this untouched, icy frontier, resisted their arrival for so long? It is 4000 BC. The rest of Europe has already felt the Neolithic revolution for over 1,000 years. From the Danube to the Atlantic coast, farmers have replaced foragers, their villages dotting the land like constellations. Yet here, north of the Baltic, the Scandinavian hunter-gatherers, SHG, still rule the shores. Seal hunters, elk stalkers, masters of the sea. Then they arrive. Descendants of Anatolian Earlies, European farmers, EEF, moving north from the continent. We see their fingerprints in the graves of the funnel beaker culture, TRB, at excavations at sites like Barker in Denmark and Ansarv on Gotland tell the same story. A sudden and overwhelming genetic replacement. Within a generation, in southern Scandinavia, SHG ancestry all but disappears, replaced by the EEF genetic signature. They bring more than seeds. They bring domesticated cattle and sheep, barley and wheat, and an ideology written in stone. Across Denmark, Skåne and Öland, they raise megalithic tombs, passage graves and dolmens that still stand today, marking the land with the power of their dead. The shift is visible in the bones. Isotope studies reveal a dietary revolution. The marine-rich diet of the hunter-gatherer is replaced almost overnight by bread, milk, and beef. The sea loses its crown to the ploughed field. But resistance brews. On the islands and outer coasts, a culture refuses to yield, the pitted ware culture, PWC. At Ajvidi on Gotland, their graves still hold harpoons, seal bones and jewellery carved from porpoise teeth. Their DNA is pure SHG, no farmer ancestry at all, even centuries after contact. Conflict is written in archaeology. Flint arrowheads of PWC style are found buried in the ribs of domesticated cattle, in the walls of farmsteads. These are not isolated skirmishes. This is a shadow war between worlds. And yet the farmers push further, the forests fall, and the old coast peoples are hemmed into smaller and smaller edges of the map. But these last hunters would hold out for 1,000 years, and then vanish without a trace. Vanished, yet not in the way you might think. Because when archaeologists dug into the graves of these final hunter-gatherers, the pitted ware culture, living between 3,500 and 2,500 BC, they found something that defied every expectation. Their bones held no trace of farmer ancestry at all. Zero. Genetic testing, including the landmark Skoglund et al. 2014 study, proved it beyond doubt. These people were pure descendants of the Mesolithic Scandinavian hunter-gatherers, SHG. Even after 1,000 years of living beside farming cultures, they had resisted not just the plough, but genetic mixing itself. They were a maritime world unto themselves, seal bones stacked in ceremonial pits, fish hooks carved from elk bone, log boats cutting silently across the Baltic waters, long before the first Viking ship was ever built. At sites like Ajvid on Gotland, their dead were buried with ornaments of porpoise teeth, as if the sea itself was their bloodline. They wanted nothing from the farmers and gave nothing back. This was cultural autonomy on a scale almost unheard of in prehistory. For over a millennium they stood apart, and then, suddenly, they were gone. Not faded, not absorbed, gone. Around 2500 BC, their genetic signature vanished completely from the DNA of modern Scandinavians. Today, no one alive carries their unbroken line. The cause? Not a great plague, not climate collapse. The truth is far more violent and far more final. From the far eastern steppes of modern-day Ukraine and southern Russia, western steppe herders began to move westward. They came with horses, two-wheeled carts, and a new language family that would eventually dominate much of Europe. Their arrival was not slow, it was a human tidal wave. The pitted ware people, the last living echo of the ancient SHG, could not withstand it. Within generations they were replaced, their culture silenced, their bloodline broken. And when these riders came, they didn't just conquer the land, they replaced the people. Now, imagine you are one of the last descendants of the old world. You stand on a windy hilltop, looking out over the forest edge when you see movement. Not deer, not elk, but men, mounted on creatures you've never seen before. They move like the wind itself, faster than any hunter on foot, the ground trembling beneath their approach. Their weapons gleam in the sun. Their voices carry across the valley. It is 2800 to 2600 BC. The Western Steppe herders, WSH, descendants of the Yamnaya culture, have crossed into Scandinavia, part of a vast corded ware expansion that sweeps across Europe like a tide. But here in the north they take on a local form, the battle axe culture in Sweden, the single grave culture in Denmark. The change is instant and irreversible. At Bersgraven in Sweden, an entire burial site reveals what happened. DNA shows an almost complete replacement of the local Neolithic farmer genome. These are not slow marriages between neighbours. This is genetic takeover within a few generations, and with them comes a technological shockwave. The horse, the first ever seen in this land, turns war and travel into something unrecognisable. Two-wheeled carts roll across the plains, carrying goods and warriors farther than human legs ever could. They bury their dead alone. Single grave burials, not the collective tombs of the old world, sprinkled with red ochre, weapons at their side, faces turned toward the rising sun. Even the male genetic legacy changes. Where once the I2Y chromosome lineage dominated, now the R1A and R1B haplogroups surge in, the genetic markers of the steppe, rewriting the paternal line of Scandinavia forever. But the most surprising thing is not what they brought, it's what they refused to take. But these new arrivals didn't blend in, not at first. For centuries the dead told the story, not the living. I want you to picture a frozen shoreline and 3 different funerals happening within a day's walk of each other. This is Scandinavia, c. 2600 to 2200 BC after the steppe riders arrive, a land holding 3 peoples in one uneasy breath. First, the newcomers, battle axe culture, Sweden, and single grave culture, Denmark, the northern face of the corded werewave. Their graves are single burials, dusted with red ochre, a battle axe by the hand, sometimes a 2-wheeled cart nearby. Teeth and bone tell us they moved far. Strontium isotopes mark high mobility across valleys and coasts. Early DNA from these graves shows strong western steppe herder ancestry, with R1A/R, 1B men now present, the genetic stamp of the riders. Walk west into older fields and you meet the heirs of the first farmers. The Funnel Beaker TRB communities. They still honour their dead in megalithic tombs, dolmens and passage graves raised in Denmark, Scania, Öland. Diets from bone chemistry are clear. Cereals, cattle, milk. Their genomes lean Anatolian early European farmer, a legacy from the first Great Migration. These stones remember a time before horses, now follow the salt and wind to the islands and outer inlets. Here the last true foragers hold on, the coastal descendants of the pitted were culture, PWC. At Ajvide, Gotland, the grave still cradles seal bones, bone fish hooks, ornaments of porpoise teeth. Their DNA remains near pure SHG, Scandinavian hunter-gatherer, even centuries after farmers and herders press in. In some layers, no farmer ancestry at all. The sea is still their pantry, their altar, their boundary. For a while, these worlds barely touch. Ancient genomes show minimal early admixture between corded were herders and TRB farmers. Pitted were people stay genetically apart. The reasons are human. Languages no one else understands. Rituals no one dares break. Pride that guards the blood. Yet the riders make a statement the living cannot ignore. At several sites, they reuse megalithic tombs raised by farmers, placing their own dead among older ancestors. It is more than a burial, it is a claim. Archaeology whispers of tension. PWC flint arrowheads turn up in farmer cattle bones, and at fortified enclosures, raids, reprisals, a cold war on the shoreline. And still the seasons turn, the borders harden, and the distance holds. Trade glints. Songs cross valleys. A marriage here, a child there. Pressure builds like ice on a river in spring. Then something shattered the barriers and forged the people we now call Scandinavian. What if I told you that the people walking out of this fusion by 2000 BC looked almost exactly like the Scandinavians alive today? Not just in their faces, not just in their eyes, but in their DNA, in the very code of who they were. This was not a slow blending, It was a genetic convergence so decisive that ancient genomes from the Nordic Bronze Age, tested from burials in Denmark, Sweden and Norway, match modern Scandinavian DNA more closely than any earlier population. For the first time, the descendants of Western steppe herders, Anatolian early European farmers, and the last flickers of Scandinavian hunter-gatherers became one people. And with unity came ambition. The coasts of Jutland and Gotland lit up with trade. Amber from Denmark travelled as far as Mycenaean Greece, found in the tombs of warriors over 2,000 kilometres away. Bronze weapons and ornaments reached the north, despite the fact that Scandinavia had no native copper or tin, proof of sprawling trade networks stretching into Central Europe. Society reorganised. Warrior trader elites emerged, their graves rich with imported goods, their ships hugging the coastlines and cutting across the Baltic. Agriculture dominated Denmark's plains, while Norway and Sweden honed a maritime economy, fishing, sealing and controlling sea routes. This was also likely the age when the Proto-Germanic language first took root, the ancestral tongue that would one day splinter into Danish, Swedish, Norwegian and beyond. But the most staggering part is that we can still see them in the mirror. The hair colours, eye shades, facial bone structure of the Nordic Bronze Age are almost indistinguishable from today's population. Thousands of years, yet almost no visible change. It's as if the blueprint for Scandinavian was written right here, in this age of bronze and ambition. And while the South forged its identity under the sunlit sails of trade, far to the north, under skies where the sun sometimes never rose at all, something entirely different was happening. A migration no one in the South could see, yet one that would change the DNA of the Arctic forever. But in the Arctic shadows, a very different migration was underway, one that still shapes the far north today. While the South was trading amber for Greek gold, the North was welcoming strangers from beyond Europe. While the South was turning amber into Greek gold, the North was receiving strangers from a world beyond Europe. Sometime between 1500 and 1000 BC, they came, moving quietly along the icy river valleys, across the frozen lakes, through forests so deep the sun barely touched the ground. They were not farmers. They were not warriors of the steppe. They came from Siberia. Their ancestry carried echoes of ancient North Eurasians, ANE, a genetic legacy that once stretched from the Urals to the Bering Strait. They brought with them Uralic languages, the linguistic ancestors of Finnish, Estonian, and the unique tongue of the Sami. Their world revolved around the cold, reindeer herding, hunting elk through snowdrifts, fishing in ice-edged waters where no farmer would dare plant a seed. Even as centuries passed, they did not blend into the southern bloodlines. Genetic studies still show that the Sami carry a distinct profile, part Siberian, part ancient European, unlike the rest of Scandinavia. They resisted assimilation, holding their language, their customs, their knowledge of the Arctic as if it were armour. And their reach was far greater in the past. Medieval chronicles and archaeological finds suggest Sami territories once stretched deep into modern-day Sweden, Norway and Finland, far south of where they live today. Only with the spread of medieval kingdoms were they pushed northward, their land shrinking into the tundra. But here in the late Bronze Age, they were not pushed. They were the new blood of the North. And while the South filled its halls with bronze weapons, foreign beads, and the first great ships, the Sami shaped a different inheritance, one written in snow tracks, reindeer migrations, and the songs of shamans beneath the northern lights. In the DNA of modern Scandinavia, their mark is faint but enduring. a whisper from the Arctic that never fully fades. And as their story was unfolding in the north, meanwhile, in the south, Scandinavia was about to send its own people far beyond its shores. Centuries before longships cut the seas, Scandinavians were already in Europe's story. In bones, in blood, in buried names. Listen. Between the 1st and 5th centuries CE, the map begins to whisper of northerners on the move. Not yet Vikings, but kin. Their trail shows up where history can't lie, ancient DNA. In the cemeteries of the Wheelbark culture, Poland, 1st to 5th century, individuals carry 75% to 100% early Iron Age Scandinavian peninsula-related ancestry, the kind that points back to Gotland and Scania. The legends of Goths moving from the Baltic southward. The genomes agree. In Roman Britain, a grave tells it quietly. York, a man likely a gladiator, dies under imperial sky, but his marrow holds approximately 25% early Iron Age Scandinavian DNA. Another York individual, tagged by researchers as 6DT3, shows a specific Scandinavian peninsula signature. Rome's provinces were not sealed. The north had already walked in. The pattern widens. A 1st century CE female burial in Slovakia, 100% Scandinavian-related ancestry, suggests movement along the Danube corridors. In Pannonia and Hungary, Lombard graves from the mid-5th century carry Scandinavian-like components, matching traditions that the Langobards once lived in Scania before their long march into Italy. In early medieval Bavaria, among the Bajuvari, a subset of burials shows the same northern signature. It is not one tribe, it is current. You can trace names to the DNA. Goths moving from Gotland, Scania into Dacia and Thracia. Vandals from southern Scandinavia through Poland into the Iberian Peninsula and North Africa. Burgundians stepping off Bornholm, drifting toward the Rhineland. Angles and Saxons out of Jutland and Schleswig, crossing the grey water to Britain long before Norse sails darken the horizon. These are warriors sometimes, migrants often, and founders more than we admit, scattering Scandinavian ancestry into royal lines, soldier cemeteries, and frontier towns. And every step south, every oath sworn to a new king changes home as well. The departures reshape Denmark's farms, Svealand's halls, Norway's coasts. Fewer men at the hearth, new wealth flowing back, new stories hardening into identity. What the world will later call Viking is not lightning from a clear sky. It is pressure building, year after year, tribe after tribe. Because while these early northerners were planting themselves in foreign soil, the north itself was forging into something sharper, faster, and terrifyingly organised. But the world they left behind was changing into something that would make history fear their name. By the time the Viking Age dawned, the genetic die had been cast for over 1,000 years. The stage was set long before the first dragon-headed ship kissed saltwater. From around 500 BCE to 800 CE, the DNA of Scandinavia barely shifted. The blend forged in the Bronze Age held firm. This was not a land in the midst of another great migration. It was a land consolidating its identity, sharpening its tools, and learning the sea. In Vendel period Sweden, 550 to 790 CE, boat graves in Old Uppsala reveal warriors buried with ornate helmets, swords, and imported goods from as far as Byzantium. In Merovingian Norway, hill forts crown the coastlines, watching over fjords like stone sentinels. Jastorf, culture Denmark, thriving centuries earlier, had already laid the cultural foundations, ironworking, warrior aristocracy, and a deep familiarity with long-distance trade. Genetics confirms the stability. Across Iron Age burials, the Y-DNA haplogroups R1A and R1B still dominate, legacies of the steppe migrations. The maternal lines echo the same, evidence that, since the battle axe and funnel beaker days, no wave like the steppe herders had ever come again. Only trickles of foreign ancestry entered through captured slaves, visiting traders, and diplomatic marriages. The core bloodline remained Scandinavian. But isolation was not stagnation. Trade routes stretched south into Frankish lands, east toward the Volga, and west toward the North Sea islands. Ships, still not yet the sleek longships, were growing in size and range. Coastal settlements were no longer just fishing villages. They became fortified markets, places where goods, rumours, and ambitions collided. For centuries, all of this built like pressure beneath ice, the steady hum of a people testing their reach, honing their craft, watching the world beyond their shores with patient, calculating eyes. The proto-Viking world was not born in a single year. It was the slow ripening of power, the tightening of a bowstring that had been drawn for generations. But what triggered the Viking Age itself is a mystery that lies in both history and the genome.